Hei alle sammen, og velkommen til en fredag på Kokonomics. Det er helt fantastisk at så mange mennesker bruker forspilltimene på korrupsjon. Jeg kommer til å switche til engelsk om kort tid, men bare minne om, siden det er et fullt lokale utganger og den slags. Og minne om at de som ikke har sett programmet fremover, så vil jeg sterkt anbefale sesjonen som begynner klokken 10 på Sting om sexens økonomi. Det er jo tross alt fredag. But now we switch to English. The theme or the topic here tonight is corruption in a globalized world. Of course, for many Norwegians who are used to thinking that Norway is a sort of an exception to the rule, and the statistics indicate also that Norway is an exception to the rule, or that Norway has deserved its place on the list of the least corrupt countries in the world. This, of course, does not mean that corruption is non-existent in Norway, and we will hopefully get back to that as we get along. To introduce the panel, starting off with Tina Søreide. She's a professor at Norwegian School of Economics in law and economics. And she's been doing a lot of research and work on corruption, governance, markets and development. She has also worked for the Faculty of Law at the University of Bergen, at Christian Michelsen's Institute and in the World Bank in Washington, D.C. And she's been published widely and also has been serving in an advisory capacity for many leading institutions all over the world. Joel Bagan, there you are, is probably known to many of you already because he's been at many events at Kokonomics. He's a lawyer, of course, a filmmaker, living in Canada, born in the USA, and was instantly famous when he put out his film about the corporation, declaring that a corporation acts in a way that, if it were a human, would classify as a psychopath, an entity that only thinks about itself. Einar Håkås is a colleague, I'm glad to say, from Aftenposten, and he's one of the Norwegian journalists who's been doing very notable and very visible work on the effects of the black economy. I'm not sure how to translate svart arbeid into English. I
think it's the black market work or something, and tax evasion.
Yeah, and also did a very famous piece of journalism in Norway when he and a colleague took down a very big network of miscreants in the taxi business in Oslo community. He's also been awarded the Scoop Diploma and the Schibsted Journalism Award for his work. So what we thought is that Professor Søreide will start off with an introduction to the topic. After that we'll evolve into a discussion on the role of the corporation in the corruption, and also touch themes or topics that are specific to Norway. So, Professor Søreide.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. And I will start with this title of the event, Corruption in a Globalized World. And I just want to start by asking the question, why should we bother? Why should we bother about corruption on the other side of the world, or well, internationally and so on? And I just want to make it clear from the start that corruption is a real development problem. It harms society in many different ways. It leads to income differences. Those who could have done a good job, they get more concerned about grabbing. It can undermine whatever a government tries to achieve. So corruption hinders development in many different ways, and it's definitely a problem we want to solve. And in the same way, we don't want foreign companies to come and pay bribes here in Norway to secure contracts or whatever. or undermine regulations and so on, we cannot be part of the problem elsewhere, even if it leads to contracts for Norwegian companies. And this question about globalization is very interesting because globalization has affected the corruption problem in different ways. Bribery becomes much easier. The easier it is to make financial transactions, to hide ownership information and wealth in tax havens and so on, the easier it is to hide bribery. And for those who receive bribes on the government side, globalization makes it easier to launder the proceeds, so they can. It appears as if their wealth is legitimate. So globalization in terms of money moving across border and so on has facilitated bribery in many different ways, and we should also keep in mind how those who are involved may consider things that happen far away in a different culture and so on. That such aspects reduce their moral cost. We have a lot of research on that kind of aspects as well, and they manage to defend the bribes, the crimes they commit other places, in a sense. So that is also an important aspect. However, globalization has also influenced the way we control the problem. There's substantial international collaboration between governments and via international organizations in order to control corruption. So for example, if we look at what kind of integrity systems we have in Norway, criminal law, but also many other integrity mechanisms, they are very similar to what they have on the other side of the globe, and that is a result of international collaboration. And we also have mutual exchange of information in terms of during investigations and so on. So we have never had more collaboration for the sake of controlling this problem than we have now. The problem is that corruption is normally defined in the criminal law, in countries' criminal law. And when it comes to criminal law, that's normally a very personal thing for countries. They have their own paradigms and so on, so it's very difficult to collaborate when it comes to criminal law compared to other areas of law. And this problem of corruption, which very often takes an international character, has to be solved by national authorities. And in that space, we see a lot of problems. So I guess I will get an opportunity to get more into those. I think I stop here, but...
Thank you. It has been estimated by, I think, the World Economic Forum that corruption in one form or another constitutes about 5% of the global GDP. It's been estimated a worth of about $2.6 trillion. In 1975, I think it was, President Nixon declared his war on drugs, saying that the drug trade would be eradicated. The situation today is that there's more drugs in the world than there's ever been, and dealing in drugs in large quantities is more lucrative than ever. Is there a difference between that fight and the fight against corruption? Is the fight against corruption a winnable war, you think?
No, it's not a war we can win completely, because in order to run a government, a state administration, we need to delegate authority. And we need to allow government representatives to be trusted, to make decisions. We cannot have an authority that controls each and every decision that a government administration makes. So in order to have an efficient government, we need to delegate authority. And that authority can be misused. So there will always be a certain risk of corruption. But of course, there's many things we can do to react on suspected corruption. And also, there's many different forms of controlling the problem. And in terms of the development in that respect, corruption is hidden. We don't have any facts about the extent of the problem. That's part of its crime. But we have many surveys where corporations report they answer similar questions over time. And corruption seems to be, it's still a substantial problem globally. So we have not managed to deal with this problem. But one thing I just want to make you aware of is that we have very different forms of corruption. For example, the extortive forms of corruption, the forms that when companies have to pay bribes to get some kind of services that they are entitled to, offload ships in a port and so on. That kind of bribery is going down because as economies grow, we see that kind of problems decrease. When it comes to more collusive forms of corruption, where business leaders have kind of colluded with government representatives in order to get secure contracts or regulatory interpretations and so on that they both can benefit from, in those cases, both parties have an incentive to keep the crime hidden and they profit significantly. And those forms of, we can call it crony capitalism, is extremely difficult to control and prove. So we don't know how widespread it is.
So it makes more sense to own a bank than to rob a bank.
Definitely. It's your
Joel, do you think, having studied the corporation and the behavior of corporations, do you think that the rise of the corporation as the leading actor in the globalized economy is aiding and abetting in the rise of corruption also?
I think the role of the corporation is quite complicated. But before getting into that, I just want to say I'm the only person in the room of maybe 150 people who can't speak Norwegian, and yet we're all speaking English up here. So I really want to thank you for that indulgence.
Joel paid quite a large bribe to.
Yeah, that's right. I had to bribe. There's some corruption. I mean, I think when we step back a little bit and look at what we're trying to do here, we're trying to stop economic actors from doing bad things and doing harmful things. And part of that story is corruption, undoubtedly. And I think Tina has done a really great job in talking about it. But another part of the story, and I guess the one that my work is about, is how do we hold corporations and their officers accountable for causing harm to people and planet, for polluting, for abusing human rights, for deforesting, for ruining the oceans in ways that aren't corrupt at all, in terms of the definition of corruption. So I just want to talk about that a little bit, because when we look at corruption, and I think this follows from the number of times the word bribe has been used, including in describing the bribe I gave all of you to speak English, that typically what corruption is about is an individual, typically a government official, often in the developing world, though as we're going to hear, it happens here in Norway too, doing something for individual gain that belies the duties that person has as a consequence of their being part of the organization, of government, for example. This is often talked about as the principal-agent issue, that the principal is government, the agent is the individual, the official, and the agent acts in a way that does not serve the interests of the organization, and that's bad. What that concept, that idea of corruption doesn't capture are all of the harmful and exploitative decisions and actions that corporate officials make when they are in fact making them for the purpose of serving their organization, where they're not doing it for individual greed, but rather they're doing it to serve the shareholders, their principals, and the corporate body that is in effect the collectivity of those shareholders. So these actions, they may be unlawful or they may be lawful, but they're not corrupt in terms of how we normally understand corruption. So what my research is looking at is that question. How can we hold corporations and their officials accountable for the harm that they cause to advance the interests of their principals, the interests of the companies and the shareholders that they work for? And there are two factors that are really problematic. One is the corporate form itself. Adam Smith, back in 1776, when he wrote The Wealth of Nations, I'm stealing this idea from him. He said the corporation is basically a machine that creates negligence and profusion. It's basically an irresponsibility machine. It's a structure that takes responsibility away, certainly from the shareholders. We all know about limited liability, but also from the managers and directors, because the managers and directors have the protection of what's called the corporate veil. And prosecutors and regulators tend not to pierce the corporate veil. And the reason they don't pierce the corporate veil and go after those individuals who are doing bad things is because within a company, so many decisions are made, decision-making is so diffuse that it's very difficult to find what's called the operating mind behind an action. It's very difficult to say that Jim or Jane sitting at that desk made that decision to spill all of the toxins into the river. It's usually a consequence of a whole bunch of different decisions, which makes it quite exceptional, and Volkswagen is one of these exceptions recently. It makes it quite exceptional to be able to find that one individual. So instead, what we do with corporations is we say, okay, we're not going to go after the individuals, we're not going to go after the shareholders, we're going to go after the corporation itself, which has personhood under law. But the problem with that is the corporation's an abstraction. It's a legal construct. You can't put it in jail. You can't put it in prison. You can't punish it. All you can do is fine it. And for the most part, and I show this in my work, for the most part, fines are just seen as part of the costs of doing business. British Petroleum was fined $27 billion in the end of it as a consequence of the explosion in the Gulf of Mexico. It still exists as a company. That didn't put it under. I mean, it diminished it to some extent. But the point is that companies expect to be fined. Companies see law abidance as a matter of costs and benefits. What's the risk? What's the potential benefit? I'm almost done. And how likely will we get caught? So that's a big problem. That problem is compounded by globalization, because in globalization, it's becoming even more difficult for state governments to be able to prosecute and enforce their regulations, because companies can move all over the place, they can create subsidiaries, and it's just a mess in terms of being able to do that. And it's further compounded by the ideological moment we're going through, at least in my country and in the United States, and I would venture to say the European Union as well, of one where deregulation is seen as a good thing. So between globalization, deregulation, the corporate form, it's becoming very difficult to hold corporations accountable, legally accountable, for the harms that they cause.
Thank you. Einar Håkås, when you started working on your first stories about corruption in Norway, were you yourself surprised to find it at all? The reason I ask that way is that many people, I think, have this idea that corruption is almost non-existent in our country.
I was not surprised at all. As they say, my colleagues here say it's globalized, it comes here, and we and Norwegian companies go to countries where it's a lot of corruption, and I think it's here already. You said there should be a meeting about economy of sex later this evening. It's Friday. I think corruption has existed as long as selling of sex. For example, earlier times you give a little bit more meat to a person that can give you a sword sharper than those the person make to your enemies. In Norway, we have an expression, to build network, and it's positive to build network. When we come south in Europe, it's called something else. It's called mafia. And this is corruption. You know, it's organized corruption in all levels of the society. I think in Norway you have always had these different types of networks, especially religious networks. For example, here in Stavanger, you have had a lot of that when you're building the industry in Stavanger, and you had to be a member of a religious community to make business with other people. I've seen a little bit about Oslo and corruption in Oslo, and when I worked with the taxi scandal, this tax evasion, there was one man who was suspected giving permits for driving a taxi and got money back. But I don't think he got so much back. He was never charged for this. He was never brought to court for this, but he only got some wine and some dinners and some lunch. And the Norwegian High Court say that this is okay. They said that for a couple of years ago. And that was in a case with a public transport bus company in Oslo. So I think the sport leaders in Norway must be very happy about that.
Probably, yeah.
I suppose so. But for some years ago, there was the biggest robbery in Norwegian history on the other side of the lake here. Nokas robbery, 45 million kroner. And the fact is that one man went into the municipality of Oslo and he got out 90 millions 2 years later. And he was, they found out of it and he's been sitting in jail for a time. But that's just one example of a problem they have had in Oslo for many years. And now, for a couple of weeks ago, you had this selling of apartments where there were some smart guys who offered apartments to the municipality, and they earned a lot of money just in 2-3 days. And they sure had maybe one inside job to do this. So, when I worked with this Albanian criminal network, a newly published book called Black Painting. I saw that the leaders of the in the building sites, they could get some payback from these criminals, and that's also corruption between private companies and not only from official jobs and to the private business. So I think it is in fact a big problem in Norway, not only because of the globalization.
Thank you. It's been said that, Tina, you said that instead of these old school extortion schemes that people would have to pay bribes, say, to unload a ship, corruption has become more sophisticated. And the commentator Farid Zakaria wrote earlier this year about what he thinks is a corrupt political system in the USA, meaning that special interests have such political clout now, they have so much power over who gets elected, that the Congress and the Senate are in effect manned with representatives that represent special interests instead of representing the people who elected them. So that corruption now has moved into the Capitol building and resides there, which I guess could be called a very negative view, of course. But I think that he has a sort of point when you just, if corruption occurs at a high enough level, it's not called corruption, it's called politics. And how do you distinguish between the eclatant corruption and the politics?
Oh, wow. Well, you are right in the sense of bringing these different comments a bit together as well. Corruption is the problems that Joel pointed at with the corporations and what kind of influence they have is important to understand in light of the response at the law enforcement side. And one of the things we see with corruption compared to other forms of corporate crime is that those who are responsible for solving the problem will often be part of the problem. So in many countries you have substantial law enforcement, corruption in law enforcement, and that form of corruption can go all the way to the top. So that can be the politicians who are friends with the corporate leaders and protect them in a sense. And that is something that happens in all categories of countries. So definitely, but when we use the word corruption, we have to keep in mind that it is a criminal law definition. So we can have crony capitalism. We can have we call it political corruption in a common sense. But once we talk about corruption, with respect to individuals, corporations, and politicians, we have to keep in mind this criminal law definition that we actually have to know what we are talking about. And as you pointed out, these forms of networks, you can have legal forms of corruption because the gray zones can be the areas, it's very difficult to hold them liable. So I think that kind of political level problems is extremely important to consider from many different perspectives. We cannot control that problem with a criminal law approach alone. So all various aspects that influence the function of democracy and so on will become very important. But one of the things that I think is important is that we have a criminal law system that functions at the bottom. So we can have all kinds of integrity systems, control, oversight, transparency, whistleblowers, whatever. But if we don't have a solid criminal law system at the bottom, that we can hold those bandits liable, then the other integrity systems will weaken as well. So I think that counts also for the political level.
Joel?
Yeah, I think the point you make is absolutely right. When we think about corruption, we can think about it in a kind of common sense way, a vernacular way, where we use the term quite often. But then there's a technical definition, and the technical definition includes illegality. And I think the example of the common sense corruption of American politics by campaign contributions is a very interesting one, because it used to be unlawful to make certain kinds of contributions. But then in 2010, the Supreme Court of the United States, in a case called Citizens United, struck down those legal restrictions. So what might have been corrupt before was now no longer corrupt, at least in a technical way. Whereas making those contributions before would have been unlawful, and arguably you would have called it corrupt, now that law had disappeared as a result of the Supreme Court of the United States decision. So now technically, you can't call it corrupt, though from a common sense perspective, you want to say there's nothing more corrupt than what's going on in terms of money and politics. And I just want to say it's a great example of a point I was trying to make, and that is the scope of corruption and accountability decreases, it narrows as we get rid of laws and as we no longer enforce laws. And as we buy into this neoliberal notion that really we should leave it to the market to regulate itself and not have political government regulation thereof.
And I think that was Mr. Zacharias' point also, that it's sort of a dream come true if you're a corrupt person, that you can evolve in a way from holding up people at gunpoint and ending up doing something that's legal. Hey, now you wanted to add a comment.
Yes, just a comment about law and something else. Law is very important. In Norway, until a few years ago, it was in fact legal to pay bribes in Norway, and especially abroad. But it was illegal to receive corruption and bribes. There was a Norwegian supply boat from Bergen, I think, that was had no job to do, so it was sent to Finland, and they paid the custom officer in Finland to use the boat, and he was sentenced in Finland, but not the Norwegian company in Norway. I think this about politicians is very important. I wonder if anyone of you saw the documentary last night about John Daly. Yes, this EU commissioner, also called Johnny Cash. This was in Malta, and one of the people who exposed him was this journalist Daphne Galizia, who was bombed for a week ago or two. And that tells us that this is very, very serious, and it's going on all the time. Johnny Cash is not the living Johnny Cash. He is not sent to prison, but 2 days ago his 2 daughters were charged for money laundering. So the police are on the case, but nothing is happening with him.
I would like to move on to the topic of prosecution, or how are corporations and all the legal entities prosecuted or investigated or prosecuted these days? Tina, do you think you could explain to us how these cases are normally solved?
Yes, that is one of the topics I study quite a bit. And when corporations are involved in corruption somewhere in the world, the cases don't go to court. They are settled. And just to put it a little bit in context of what has been mentioned, Joel pointed at the difficulties of holding corporations liable. And that is one of the tricky things, because if we punish a corporation, we may well punish the innocent owners, pension fund, and it's extremely difficult to hold a corporation liable, and it's also extremely difficult to identify the individuals who are responsible, because for markets and for owners and for all the innocent employees, it would be convenient if we could simply hold the responsible individuals liable and let the company go on. The problem is that we have to distinguish between the crime that happens in the interest of the owners in the terms of increasing the profits of the company, and the forms of crime that happens against the wishes of the owners. These are two completely different problems, and I think the interesting part is the ones where the corporation profits. And what happens is that one of the things that I study now is how corporations actually negotiate their own penalty with the investigators, because the Wimpelkamp case that you know about, and also the Statoil case, where Statoil also was for the Iran scandal, they were punished in the United States in addition to Norway. It was the first case where the Americans punished a company abroad. In those cases, it is very interesting to see what the Americans do on these cases, because they punish more companies than any other country. And what they consider is, what did a company do to prevent this from happening? Did they self-report and so on? Because according to the law, the United States has they can place full responsibility on the company. But they reduce the punishment depending on what the company did to prevent the crime. And also if they self-reported the crime and so on. The problem is that those situations, when they have to consider what the corporation did, they have to negotiate, they have to discuss with the company, they have to ask, they have to investigate, they have there is a dialogue between the company and the investigators. And in order to get the companies to get to the table and discuss their own crime, the investigators have to offer something in return. And what's interesting in that respect is what kind of information the rest of the world gets. because if some of the crime is kept confidential, it becomes impossible to hold the government people that receives bribes. It's impossible to hold them responsible if we offer the company confidentiality about the crime. Because in some countries, companies can actually negotiate the contents of a press release about their own crime. Not in the United States, but it can happen in some other countries. So how these things happen differs from country to country. And so we don't have a harmonized system. And in Norway, we have very low predictability for corporations that want to collaborate with prosecutors in these cases.
But all these problems that you mention now, are things moving in the right direction, or are they moving in the wrong direction?
Oh, I will definitely say that it's moving in the right direction. Remember, 20 years ago, we hardly spoke about these problems. And you pointed at bribery being legal in Norway, but that it was, we didn't hold companies responsible in Norway, but it has been illegal all over the world. And what do we see in Brazil now? Petrobras scandal. We have the richest, most powerful people in the country are put to jail. So one of the things we see is not only more cases, more law enforcement cases in the United States and in Europe, but we also see it from in countries all over the world. And there's a lot of collaboration, clearer rules, much more collaboration between law enforcement institutions. And one of the interesting things that I observe now is that the private sector is a driver for more predictable rules, because many of the companies, they want to have returns from their investments in compliance systems and due diligence and so on. And for example, Norwegian companies will not necessarily have a comparative advantage in bribery. Maybe they have a comparative advantage in technology. And then it is extremely annoying for them when competitors pay bribes. So they actually want law enforcement. It's not the case that all companies, they want to have a soft system and so on. They want markets to function fairly.
But to my understanding, despite all these efforts globally, corruption has been rising steadily during the last decades. I don't know why, but that's why I mentioned the so-called war on drugs. That war has also resulted in a lot of arrests. But every time somebody is put away, another person steps up to take that place, because it's simply so lucrative to be in the business.
Can I answer?
Yeah.
Well, we have to think of what is it that we measure. Because what we see is a reduced trust in government institutions. We see reduced trust at the same time as we see growing income differences. And when we talk about corruption, we don't observe the bribe transactions. So, but we have this Transparency International. They estimate the perception of corruption. And if you look at those indicators, they are not reliable in terms of assessing the magnitude of the problem, but they can be quite reliable in terms of estimating the trust in government institutions. So one of the things that what you point at could be a big problem in terms of low trust in government institution, and then that's what they debated in, I think, in the former debate on populism and so on. So I think we don't have any figures that tell us that corruption is increasing.
But are the figures that are here, the ones that are being quoted by the IMF, for instance, or the World Economic Forum, are they reliable, or are they just like wild estimates?
They are not reliable. They are not reliable because how can you count? And if you had facts, what would you count if you were supposed to tell the magnitude of the problem? Should you count the size of the bribe, the consequences, the gains from the crime? What figure would you count if you had all the information? Even that is uncertain, and we don't have the figures. So this is a kind of guess. If we assume that in some sectors a certain percentage of all productivity is kind of corrupt in some sense, and then you can you make estimates, but they are wild guesses, but they could be true, and the problem could be bigger, but we don't know.
Yeah, I wanted to say that this is where I think it becomes very important to distinguish the issue of corruption from the issue of corporate malfeasance and corporate illegality. And the reason for that is I think it's correct that we as a global society are getting better at addressing corruption. There's no question there are more laws, there's more cooperation, there's more vigilance, there's more enforcement. That's all true. And I think that it feeds into and comes out of what Tina was talking about, this distrust of government. So there's a piece in which governments aren't trusted, they're seen to be corrupt, we have better enforcement mechanisms for ensuring that corruption is dealt with. In parallel to all of that, though, the other piece, the restrictions, the regulations, the command and control attempts to control corporations and markets are becoming weaker. The United States is an obvious example of this, where in every one of the departments in President Trump's administration, there are cutbacks. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is being completely gutted. Similar trends, deregulation trends. There's actually a law that requires deregulation in the United Kingdom. In my own country, in Canada, we have these same kinds of trends. So there's a strange kind of parallel movement of, on the one piece, a paradigm that says, don't trust governments, they're probably corrupt, and let's build in mechanisms to protect us from that corruption, and that's legitimate. But it feeds into this notion of, but we can trust corporations, we can allow them to self-regulate rather than regulate them, and we can start to roll back various restrictions that are designed to protect the environment and human rights and everything else, which is why I think conceptually and practically it's very important to understand that these two frameworks are quite different. They overlap, but they have different both ideological and practical consequences.
I guess that a vital instrument in gaining access to information is transparency and also in transactions. I know that there's been a lot of work internationally on transparency, and especially in relations to the so-called tax havens. In your work, Anna, you've also been forced to look quite a long way outside of the Norway's borders to find the money, to follow the money.
Yes. Long journeys, Pakistan, Kosovo, and some tax havens that I haven't been to. So it's a lot of that. You stop in finding the money and you follow the money. But I would like to say it's a very strange and funny thing about corruption. If you draw a map over the world of corruption in the world, you will see, that Denmark, not very much corruption there. They are on the top, I think. Norway is a little bit down, but and it's a similar map of economical growth in the world, where there is little corruption, there's a lot of growth economically. And corruption is bad for capitalism, and it destroys the competition. But it's also another thing, where it's little corruption, according to those maps you can draw. There's Lithuanian people dominate, and the others, I can say that, it's Catholics and Orthodox.
It's the Catholics again, right?
But they are used to pay indulgences. So I think maybe they see even God as corrupt.
I won't ask you to comment on that specifically, but does Einar have a point in that corruption is distributed unevenly throughout the globe, and could corruption be linked to culture in some way or another?
Oh yes, definitely. We see there's not the exact amount of corruption all over the world. That is clear, and we have different quality of institutions. But one of the things we have to keep in mind is that the magnitude of corruption tells us something about the position of state institutions in a society. So, for example, in Afghanistan, if people say there's like so much corruption, or in Somalia, or wherever, but they don't have a state that functions. So they have to pay something in order to get health services, in order to get their kids into school. And of course, maybe those, ideally, there shouldn't be payments, but the school system doesn't function. And so in some societies, we have to understand that the payment is a kind of informal solution when the state institutions are absent or not functioning at all. And it's just a pragmatic solution for ordinary people. So we cannot simply just say, oh, it's so corrupt. It's because people try to make their society function. However, this form of crony capitalism and high-level corruption grabbing is something that I think people try to do in all societies, and we have different quality on the barriers against it, but we see it happens in Norway as well. And when we look at different areas in Norway, commune, the different local level governments, we see that there are substantial problems, and there are whistleblowers who try to report about it. We have the mayor is a sister of the person who runs the electricity, whatever. We have serious problems also in some areas in Norway. So when the barriers against the problem is not functioning, we see problems. So in that sense, it's not only a cultural problem, it's something related to human nature, but the quality of the constraints is different. But I just want to add one little thing, and that the barriers, the integrity mechanisms don't have to come from the government only. We can also have private enforcement. And one of the positive developments is that we also see now an increasing trend that companies complain more when they are victimized by competitors' corruption. They do complain more in societies where institutions are functioning, and they think that it makes sense to complain. But also, they can sue each other. They can claim a compensation when they've been victimized. And there's a lot of arbitration cases going on, which we don't see. We simply hear about the public enforcement, but there's also private enforcement that is developing positively.
And that it has to be a problem there, because one of the reasons for punishing unwanted behavior is to make that punishment public and discourage other people from repeating the mistake or the crime. So when you remove that element, what's in it for us?
To punish.
To punish. Okay.
Well, can I answer? When it comes, of course, there's a different thing between individuals and corporations. But when we punish corporations now, traditionally we have been thinking only about a fine. How big fine should a company pay? Huh? And now we forget about the personal liability and the Jolunda case and whatever. But how big should a fine be? But that's a very one-dimensional reaction. Because what we see now developing is systems for compliance-based defense, in the sense that companies can have a lower punishment the better systems they have to prevent. The problem is then that the investigators have to consider, what did the companies have in place? And we can have a similar logic for the public sector that I think will develop. We are not there yet, so we focus on the private sector for now. But in terms of regulation, we can have monitoring of corporations. We can have, as a form of punishment, it's possible to have an oversight function and to have controllers to monitor whatever they do for a period of, say, 3 years. It's possible to insist that they should not operate in certain markets. It's possible to say go out of defense sector, for example, and that happens. So at this stage, those reactions are very unpredictable because countries have not developed principles for such law enforcement systems, but they are coming. And you have probably heard about debarment from public procurement. A company can be excluded from markets because of corruption. It doesn't often happen in practice, but the laws are there. So it's possible to react in different ways, and it is possible to hold leaders, individual leaders, responsible to a certain extent, even if that is very difficult when it comes to criminal law.
Joel, going back to what you said about the role of the corporation, the way I understand it is that you postulate that the corporate entities tend to make the companies less responsible than, as opposed to, say, a privately owned company or a hva heter stiftelse? Hjelp meg. Foundation. Sorry. But has there been conducted any empirical research to find out if this is true? Are, in fact, corporations more irresponsible, more criminal than privately owned companies or foundations?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, I think foundations tend to be different and a bit more oranges to apples. But if we compare privately held companies to publicly held companies, I think the answer is that the empirical evidence shows that there is no real difference in the possibilities of they're either acting in ways that are corrupt or they're acting in ways that are harmful to the environment and society. I think the difference between a publicly traded company and a privately held company is that the privately held company actually has a choice. It's not subject to the same legal requirements, the same fiduciary duties to its absentee owners, the shareholders. So in a closely held company, for example, there can be a decision, we're going to make less money, and I'm thinking of Patagonia, which you know they make jackets and things like that as an example of this. There can be a decision that we're willing to make less profit in order to give effect to certain environmental values. You can't do that in the same way in a publicly traded company, and I think that's where the fundamental difference lies.
Okay. Well, I think that the difference between public and state-owned companies is very interesting in a Norwegian context because we have many state-owned companies and we have them in the most exposed sectors. We don't have ownership in those sectors because we want to benefit from corruption, but it's natural to have state ownership in sectors that are difficult where it's difficult to operate, to make competition function. What we see in Norway is that the state-owned companies are more transparent. There's more information about their operations, but they're also more inclined to accept risk, including corruption-related risks.
Thank you. We are going to close here, but I wanted to ask you a question about the work that you've been doing. I know that many people have asked you this before, but I think it's still interesting. What is it that you are looking for when you are? What are the warning signs, or what kind of things make you interested in a case? Are there any? Is there like a golden rule for you that this looks corrupt? I want to look at it.
No. Sometimes it comes a telephone and says that you should look at this, or we see different types of signs that can tell us that.
Give us an example of a sign that you look for.
For example, when I worked with my last book, these Albanian networks, they come into a building site. How come they can do that? Somebody let them in, and there will be one person or a group of persons that get a kickback, because when I investigate the price they come in for per hour, it's approximately a normal price. And then I think it's kickback to this main company that's high up in the building site. So when I see a thing like that, I try to investigate it. But it's very, this is brown envelopes with money in. So you have to film it, put it on video, take photos, and to document it. Or you can find out that they have worked on this private house or something. But it's very difficult to find out. But in this Unibus scandal in Oslo, it was it was the police who did very good work there, and it was also some different companies that told about the story because they risked a lot of years in jail. So they told about the leaders in Unibus that had received money for corruption.
Yeah. We would like to have some questions if you have any. I have this mic here. I could borrow you, or I could just repeat your question if that's more convenient for you. So please just raise a hand to anybody, please. Over there.
It's a question mostly to the Norwegian participants, but maybe also in a general aspect to Professor Bacon. Azerbaijan is the 123rd country on the transparency list. And we all know the monetary value and political power of oil. And Statoil has been present there for many years. Though it's been decreasing after 2015 of the sale of Chardonnay's gas field, it's still present there. I've always been puzzled about why the media hasn't been putting a big question mark. Why has Statoil been allowed to pump up oil in a country like Azerbaijan? Because you don't win a contract in Azerbaijan on the commodity of oil because you have the best technology. Well, but first to Mr. Bacon, do you think that an oil company can win a contract in Azerbaijan because they have the best technology?
No.
That's my point. That's an objective. You don't know the case, of course, in specific, but you know the BP presence in Azerbaijan. And so now Norwegians.
I can maybe answer the first one. I know that many journalists have tried to expose this thing in Azerbaijan, but it's difficult to find it documented, and I think that's why it's never been a story. I think there's been some stories, but not the whole truth. So.
Yes, I have to make a comment on this one because this is one of my deep concerns as well. I've never visited Azerbaijan, but I visited Angola several times, which is a parallel situation in a sense. Well, the situation is that we have oil production that we profit from in countries that have a non-legitimate leadership, and regardless of what kind of contracts and how they are obtained, the government is corrupt. They steal the money, and the society cannot benefit from the resources. So this is a huge moral dilemma, but there could also be clear-cut bribes paid in the transactions, which may have happened. But regardless of that problem, it's also a problem that we profit from in collaboration with corrupt dictators in a sense.
That's not a question.
That is not a question. Okay, well then, it is. So you ask if it is possible to operate in Azerbaijan without paying bribes.
Well, that's more a general question. But I was puzzled. Why hasn't there been more attention to it?
I think there is a lot of intention to it. I think it has been debated many places, but I don't think the government of Norway does enough to.
Well, you have some media representatives there. Has it been much debated in the Norwegian media, the Statoil presence in Azerbaijan? I haven't noticed.
It depends on what you mean with much, I think. But it has certainly been debated. I don't want to participate as a panelist here, but yeah, in my paper, there's been quite a few stories about both Azerbaijan and Angola and other countries over the years. I think I'm getting threats now from the staff that I will be physically punished if this goes on because we are running very late. We have time. I've decided. Let's bribe. It's a very good idea. We have tried for one last question, and that goes to Kalle Mone over there.
I really wanted to, so if we have a former chair of Statoil's board sitting here, it'd be very interesting to sort of challenge him on some of these issues. And also ask him why has Statoil stopped responding to criticism in the newspapers for different involvements, whether it is in Venezuela or Angola or whatever. They don't respond anymore, and I think it's really a democratic problem that this is a company out of control, owned by us. But the chairperson that I really like very much, I encourage him to take the word.
Okay, so let's do that. Stein Bredal, you've been on the Statoil board for many years. You have your opportunity now to answer.
Yeah, I've been to Baku as well. I was involved with what happened in Iran, and I was the only one on the board that worked at Statoil office at Force. So I was I didn't like to sit in front of my computer, so I went around. And then a lot of people told me there's corruption in Iran. So I got all the papers, and well, I can tell now, I had some business with Dagens Næringsliv in Verksgaten. So I gave them a lot of papers, and it became a big thing. And eventually we had this board meeting, first board meeting. Olaf Fjell was still the boss. But then I got more papers, and I also called Kasi Kulman Five and said, we need 3 people from Statoil, Force, to tell what's going on. And when they met and told the real story, that was out with Olaf Fjell. Then I tried to go with both Azerbaijan, Nigeria, Angola. So my lawyer, Håkon Helle, we had an appointment with Eva Jolie. So we went into Oslo, stayed at Grand Hotel, and just after we ordered the taxi, the secretary in Stavanger court said, Eva Jolie can't meet you, because this is taking too much, publicity. And then 1 month later, I had a meeting with functioning Økokrim boss, Erling Grimstad, and he said, nobody in Norway wants to have these cases exposed. He said, not the owner, Norsk Arbeiderparti, not the management, and certainly not the trade unions, because they don't like to work in a company that is on first pages. So there was a lot of things that we wanted to ask Eva Jolie and others, what's going on in Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan. A lot of millions gone to Switzerland, to Americans. Obviously corruption, but nobody wants to touch it. Thank you.
So with that corporate horror story, we have to draw it to a conclusion.
Can I just say one thing? That would never happen in my country. A, that there would be a director from a big company at an event like this, and B, that they'd actually take the microphone and respond to a question. They would have been ushered out of here so fast into their limousine.
Thank you very much, and have a wonderful festival this night and tomorrow. See ya.